Thank you very much for the invitation. It's not often that in my current role I have the opportunity to look at some real work, and especially not at research and in universities. It's where I have spent a lot of my professional life, so it's always a pleasure to come back and to see what's happening and how things are progressing. So I'm going to talk to this topic here: research policy linkages, some lessons from DFID. I think you will probably all agree that we don't have as many positive experiences on successful research policy linkages in environment-related issues as we would like there to be. While on the one hand we can say that climate change is an example where science has really driven the policy agenda and has resulted in actually quite major shifts in investments, in private investments across the world. There are many other cases like this one. This is the Club of Rome report, where how much more research we throw at this topic, it all falls really on deaf ears. And this is unfortunately the case for many of our environmental topics. So I'm going to try and talk to you on three things which, in my experience, help us to move forward in this difficult area of evidence-based policy making or science influencing policy making effectively. And I've got three messages basically based on this experience I have had so far. The first one is that we must make sure that our science is believable. This is very important. Unfortunately, it's not always the case, but it is very important. Probably the most important of the three. The second message that I'd like to convey is that the science we do needs to offer solutions. We know we're doomed. We know the climate is about to boil the oceans out of the world, and we know that biodiversity will crash very soon and we'll all die. So we know all of this, but now we need the solutions. But of course it always takes two to tango, and policymakers have to do their bit as well, and policymakers need to use the evidence that's given to them. This is probably also an area where we haven't been as good as we should have been. So let's look at the first one. Science has to be believable. Now, of course, you all know what this entails. This is all about the scientific method of inquiry. I used to teach first years in East Anglia. That was one of the topics. So this is all about formulating hypotheses. It's all about setting up experiments. It's all about testing these hypotheses. And it's all about these dreaded statistics. And all about experimentation. But of course, in the environment, it's complicated. Very often, we work in very complex systems with many components and subcomponents and lots of processes and sub-processes. And we often don't really have two of the same to compare and run experiments on. On climate change, it's very simple. We only have one Earth, and we can only run one experiment on it, which we are busily doing, and we have nothing to compare it with, let alone do some repeat sampling. So it's complicated, and we use models, and we've seen a lot of efforts being put in the two ESPA programs that were presented here in developing models. Now, these models need to be calibrated. You have to find parameters for all these flows, initial conditions for all these components. You need to validate the result. You have to run it and compare it with some kind of historical data to see that it works. You have to do this for the whole, and you have to do this for components. And of course, there are many of those parameters. We can't really measure those things. We have to guess them. And this is where the fun starts. And this is where very often we tweak the parameters to make sure that the outcome is what we want. This is a big danger in a lot of environmental research and a lot of research that uses complex models. Second bit, it's all contextual. It all depends on where you work. So one thing we often do is we ask the locals, as my colleague David Howlett does here with a group of Maasai in Arusha in November last year. But are they always right? This study, for instance, tried to find out to what extent the perceptions of local people in Kenya, in this case, in the Machakos district, to what extent their perceptions that yield declines in the 1990s, their perceptions that these yield decreases were caused by a decrease in rainfall. Well, this study looked at to what extent this perception of this linkage was actually true. And in this case, I think you would all see that this isn't necessarily the case. It's a very interesting paper, and I really would recommend you read it. There is a very interesting continuation of this story, which is not necessarily relevant to what I want to say here, but which is worth pursuing. So those authors in this particular case seem to say, well, the locals, they don't necessarily always have it right. So we have to be careful and test these things. And then, of course, at the end of it all, science is a social enterprise, and it's a human enterprise. It's a human and a social process within which all these individual and social drivers come to play. Biases, interests, these authors call these things priors. And I'm sure that we all know about these things. I found this table very useful. It comes from a paper by the authors here at the bottom. I shall not try and pronounce the name of the first author. I'm sure you can read this. And it's about the meta-analysis of a number of meta-analyses on aid effectiveness. This is research that looks at the extent to which financial aid we provide causes increases in growth in developing countries. I will not tell you what the result of that research is, of the meta-analysis is. You can read that for yourselves. It is rather depressing reading. But what these authors looked at was the extent to which the literature on aid effectiveness actually reflects this sad result. And it doesn't. It actually reflects entirely the opposite. And when they started looking at this, they discovered that actually most of that research and most of that literature is very much infiltrated by a whole range of interests and biases. And I'm sure you recognize some of these. There is the polishing bias. You have to publish to flourish, and polishing means that results are often too good. You have to present something that's very clear. Present something that is publishable. Present something that will be picked up by something like Nature or PNAS rather than some obscure journal deep inside Belgium. Goodness. Goodness. I am Belgian, I'm allowed to say these things. Goodness is a very difficult is a very difficult bias to fight against, especially in my area of business. And here it says in this aid effectiveness literature, oh, Marcella is back online, I see. Researchers want to be seen as good and their activity to have a good purpose. Now, to find a negative result in an aid effectiveness piece of work actually is somehow causes a lot of challenges. You have to declare that actually all this aid we've given to Malawi, all this aid we've given to Nepal, sorry, there's no benefit from it. It would take quite a courageous person to actually declare something like that. So we will avoid saying this, and we will put lots of caveats to this. Look, for instance, at all the climate change literature, where some of the effects are perhaps not as bad as people thought they were. Lots of caveats. Let us not forget that climate change is a bad thing and blah, 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 blah. So goodness is a bias that we are often confronted with. And author history. How many of us are going to be as courageous as Mark Linus, Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth, activist who for many years went out to destroy GMO test sites and who last year or earlier this year has completely turned coat, has completely turned around his story and said that he was wrong, that actually GMOs are not necessarily bad, and that the work he did in the past to destroy that wasn't necessarily well informed. So all kinds of biases, interests, priors they call these things in that particular literature, that affect the way in which we conduct and the way in which we analyze and the way in which we publish our work. And I'm sure that you're aware in environmental sciences of examples like that. So first message, let's make sure that whatever evidence we construct, whatever science we deliver, whatever research we do is robust. It passes the laugh test. We are conscious of where our biases are, and where there are biases, we are transparent about them. And we calibrate and validate our models, and we try and avoid as much as possible to tweak all the knobs on these models. And if we do all that, I think that you will already probably have advanced 50% of having a positive relationship with policymakers. So second one, let's concentrate on offering solutions. As I said, we already know that we're all going to boil and burn in hell, so let's not continue to do research on that. But of course, what does this require? It requires us to talk to those policymakers, and I'm not going to talk too much about this. You've heard a few things already on the two presentations from ESPA, but I will refer you to a recent publication by NERC, which I think is spot on in terms of giving advice to researchers on where it is they can interact with policymakers in the UK. And there's a little chapter in here also on how to link into international policy processes. But examples work much better. This is an example which I think is a good example, largely because I was very much part of this example. I do declare a bias here. It concerns the results of a program, a climate science research partnership between the Hadley Centre and my department, the Department for International Development. And it's a program in which we asked the Hadley Centre to try and improve our understanding of climate in Africa, and also in the same kind of trend, improve their models and improve global circulation models, especially in terms of their performance over Africa, so that we get more accurate predictions. But we also asked them to do this in such a way that the outputs from these models would be useful to users and policymakers. So prior to starting this work, we went on a big walkabouts across the continent. We went to various countries, and we asked questions in formal and informal ways to a number of stakeholders. And what came out of this were a number of things. One of them was a very strong and powerful request from most stakeholders to give them a good estimate of the start of the rainy season. For many stakeholders, this is an incredibly valuable piece of information. If they have to choose between that and the amount of rainfall, they'd rather know when the first rains are going to come down. When do the clouds arrive from the intertropical convergence zone? And so the Hadley Centre team set their minds on that particular problem rather than on temperature and rainfall. And lo and behold, they managed to construct their models in such a way that they provide this prediction. And this is actually a very robust prediction. It involves a whole set of processes that are quite predictable, much more predictable than other things, certainly in West Africa and in East Africa. And as a result of this program, they now issue every 6 months or so an early warning of the probabilities of having early rainfall across this region. These are the amber and the red areas, or the opposite probability of late onset rainy seasons. And they distribute this to the regional meteorological centers across Africa. So this is, for me, an example of a very simple, positive interaction between policymaker and scientist, where basically the scientists and the policymakers went to talk to each other in terms of identifying what needs and potential products were, and then the scientists got on with their job, provided some robust science, didn't tweak too many buttons on their global circulation models, and came out with something which they are now testing and validating in the field. So not that complicated, really. One thing that policymakers are incredibly interested in these days, and it's quite nice that I heard very similar messages from Emma Tompkins over lunch today. We're very interested these days in things that are to do with what works and what doesn't. And that goes away towards responding an earlier question about how we make sure that in these difficult times we can keep on selling to our respective publics, here the British public and for Kirsten the German public, that what we do is effective. It is crucially important that we get our story right here, and it is crucially important that we engage scientists in giving us robust information on the extent to which we are achieving our objectives. And we have a framework for this which is called the theory of change. I'm sure that you have had to pick this up whenever you have had to deal with projects with development organizations. It speaks to itself. These are very simple things. Don't forget, policymakers are simple people. But the things that we are very interested in is evidence to show us that the inputs we provide are going to be efficient at giving us an output. And we are also very interested in robust evidence on the cost effectiveness of getting inputs translated into sustainable impacts. So impact evaluations are very important. There is quite a whole body of science that is being thrown at this for the moment on a whole range of impact evaluations. One of the tools they use, which we like a lot, are randomized controlled trials. A lot of social scientists don't like randomized controlled trials. I think it's largely because they don't like statistics, but they tell me that this is not true. There are much more fundamental reasons why they don't like randomized controlled trials. Be it as it may, it is to us quite an important tool. And systematic reviews. It's not enough to have one piece of evidence saying something. It is much, much better if 15 or 20 or 50 bits of evidence, all independently established, say a similar kind of story. So systematic reviews are things that are very important to us, very much in the area of what works, what doesn't. Not in the area of that's the problem. We know what the problem is, but much more in terms of does this policy, does this mechanism to provide payments for environmental services, is this an effective and a cost-effective way of achieving this? Third point, as I said, it takes two to tango. You don't have successful science policymaker interaction if the policymaker doesn't use the evidence. So the policymakers must play ball. I'm a bit worried about this mixed metaphor, but never mind. I must acknowledge here that we in the policymaker and the donor community haven't always been as good at using evidence as we might have had to be, whatever the grammar is. And this is something that we came to realize about 3 to 4 years ago. And we've really undergone quite a change in the organization to make sure that whatever we do is much more evidence-based than it was in the past. And this is very much, this is the example of this is very much in our business case design cycle. And this is set out here on this slide. It starts by identifying what the problem is. So many people malnourished. What are the options to address this problem? What's our theory of change and logical framework? What are the management arrangements? And so on and so on. So we have a framework to design these things. It has been inflicted on us from Treasury, by Treasury, and we follow this thing religiously. The requirement these days is that each section of this has to be referenced by and has to be based on robust evidence, very much the same way as your PhDs have to have plenty of citations in them, and these citations have to be from peer-reviewed literature. And we insist on this in our business cases these days. Now, we've been doing this for a while, and a review of this through our quality assurance mechanism last year showed that, in general, we're quite good at this in terms of defining the problem. This is probably because you guys are giving us lots of evidence about the problem, but also because we have a similar kind of mindset. We analyze the problem to death, but we have much less evidence about the feasibility of what we propose we should do about it. So we have been asked to research that much more, and certainly our research commissioning body in DFID is certainly commissioning much more work in this area. It's one thing to use evidence, it's another thing to use strong evidence. What is strong evidence? We have recently adopted a number of criteria to assess the strength of the evidence, and our quality assurance unit's job is to actually check each bit of evidence we use in our business cases to see to what extent this is actually strong evidence. And these are some of the criteria we use. I'm sure you recognize these things. Conceptual framing, openness and transparency. Is there a link to the raw data in the analyses? Appropriateness and rigor, validity, reliability, cogency. I quite like that cogency thing. I'm not sure I understand it, but never mind, it's a nice word. So it's not sufficient to actually use evidence. We must make sure that the evidence we provide to support an action in our business cases is actually strong. And this doesn't only apply to an individual piece of work, but it also applies to a body of evidence. Hence our interest in systematic reviews. So to summarize and conclude, there are perhaps also some limitations to all this. For us to have a successful partnership between science and policy making, there are perhaps three things we might want to remember. One of them is that our science has to be believable. And I've talked to this, and I'm sure that this is something that is close to your heart. We have, in the last 10 years, we have seen a lot of science which doesn't really pass that test. And we have promoted also a lot of science that doesn't pass that test. And that has not been good. We have promoted development, we have promoted programs that were not based on rigorously established facts and on rigorously established knowledge. We certainly want to change this. We don't want to continue to do this. If you give us robust evidence, we will probably, or hopefully, use it appropriately. Secondly, concentrate on offer solutions. Talk to us in terms of what we need, but not only to us, also to the private sector, to people in the countries where you work. Help us especially find out what works, what doesn't. There are some interesting examples I could quote if you're interested. And lastly, we have to make sure on our side that we use the evidence that you give us, and that we use actually the strong evidence you provide us. But also that we change our approach to implementing a particular area of business or a particular project when the evidence for what we do is weak. There is a growing set of tools that we can use: theories of change, impact evaluation, systematic reviews, and we can take heart from the fact that in some cases our science, especially in the case of climate change, has actually had quite a major impact on policy. So if we apply some of those principles, I'm sure that we will be as successful, or perhaps even more successful, as we have been in the area of climate change, where the IPCC, which is a super kind of meta-analysis of whatever evidence there is out there, robust evidence there is out there, and there are very, very strict protocols as to what goes in and what isn't allowed into the IPCC, This is perhaps a nice example of something that really works. Does that mean that that everything we establish, all the evidence we use, will automatically be translated in the policy that we want? No. Unfortunately, the world is more complicated than that. Very often, the bit of evidence we provide is only one stream of evidence, and policymakers need other bits of evidence in order to get a complete picture. And secondly, many interest groups in society also have very different objectives in terms of what they want from government. So the process of policy making isn't necessarily as simple as there is a bit of evidence there, so therefore this is what we do. You might not always get what you want at the other end, but if you do your job well, and we stick to our guns as well in terms of using your evidence well, then we will probably get the best that we can get. So thank you very much for your attention.